The fires are not out yet, but thoughts are already turning to rebuilding. It's hard to know where people will begin in Fort McMurray, as so much damage has been inflicted on the city and its neighborhoods. My next guest is joining me in the studio here. He's someone who works out these practicalities. Paul Kovacs is the founder and executive director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction at Western University. His expertise is in reducing the risk of loss from disasters, including wildlife, and in disaster resilience, the ability of a community to bounce back after a catastrophe. Hi, Paul. Welcome to Cross Country Checkup.
Welcome. Good to see you, Duncan.
What is the priority once the flames are out?
The immediate next step is to make sure that everybody is safe and that it's a good time to come and look in the community and see where their loss and the damage is. But once we know where the loss and damage is, then it's time to get on with the rebuilding. This is a process that we've had to do before in Slave Lake and Kelowna and elsewhere. We have to put homes back. We have to put back the businesses, the schools and the hospitals and other things that are damaged. And it's a process that takes years.
What specific things would you be keen to look at as populations start talking about returning?
So fire is usually very destructive. There are other events like floods where there's some water, you can get the water out and then maybe you can just move back in, or it may have done great destruction, so finding the degree of damage for some perils. But fire is often quite catastrophic. The home, the neighborhood is simply gone. And so there's a need to assess by proper government officials whether it's safe to rebuild. There can be toxic chemicals that build up from the ash that falls from the fire that is burned, and is the ground that's being built upon safe to build again? Once that's all done, then you just get on with the construction phase. You have to get usually these are covered by insurance. You have to have the insurance company come in and look at the nature of the damage and the loss and agree on how to rebuild and how to get going.
If the ground is safe, that's got to be a difficult task in and of itself.
It's incredibly important. It was a big part of the Slave Lake event too. The heat of this fire, the degree of the burning, you can imagine the chemicals that were let free. We didn't just have trees that burned, we had houses that burned underground, we had cars that burned and other things, and all of this has gone somewhere, often into the ground.
The water treatment plant in Fort McMurray seems to have survived. That's the latest that we've got. If that's the case, how helpful is that?
That's incredibly important. So you can start the process of putting back a new home or a business, but you can't actually move back into that community unless all the systems work. So you need a water treatment facility, you need electricity and phones and cable and all of those essential supplies to make the whole system work. Water treatment is something that can often take a very long time to put in place. So that's one of the key things that needs to be checked really thoroughly, and if that's up and running, then that's really going to be helpful for the homes that were not damaged and for the homes that will need to be rebuilt.
You mentioned supplies. I can't even begin to imagine the massive amounts of supplies that are going to need to be brought in. What's the biggest challenge there?
Fort McMurray is a community where the logistics of supplying have been thought about for many, many years. It's always been in a relatively remote area with mainly one road in, but there's other ways to get supplies in, maybe by aircraft or whatever, but one road to take in most supplies. So there have been many times where to feed the very unique production facilities, big convoys of materials have had to be brought up that road. So it's a community that thinks about these things, but now we have to go find all of these supplies. So if you're rebuilding many homes, you have to find a lot of lumber, you have to pour a lot of concrete. There's many things that will need to be done, and again, this will take time. You need to find the people to do the building, and you need to find the construction materials to do the construction.
We were speaking with a fire ecologist, Robert Gray, and he was talking about, the vegetation in the area has just been absolutely scorched. What kind of impacts does that have in the surrounding area in the months and years ahead?
It's incredibly important that we've had events, including Kelowna not that long ago, and many events elsewhere around the world, where the fire changes the landscape and leaves a community prone to other risks. Slave Lake has had, Fort McMurray has had flooding in the past. And so having all these trees now burned to the ground, the flooding risk is now changed.
Right.
It's not better or worse. It's simply a different kind of risk. The water can hit the ground and move faster, and
right.
The water can hit the ground and carry various chemicals and whatever when it comes to the river. So the risk of flooding is going to be quite different for the next few years.
Okay. We're hearing the folks who have been phoning in today say they're bound, that they're going to rebuild there. But I've got to assume that they're bound to be people who won't go back to Fort McMurray. And is that something that's common when a place gets devastated like this?
So we completed a study last year, and we went to hundreds of homes that were destroyed in Kelowna and Slave Lake, the two biggest fires that we've had in our history. And we wanted to appraise
200 homes in Kelowna and about 500 in
exactly.
Slave Lake.
Yeah, almost 250 in Kelowna and almost 500 in Slave Lake.
Okay.
And we went to every one of the homes to see what we had done since. What kind of home we put back? Did we put it back better? How are we taking care of that risk? And we found there were many that were not back. To actually put a number on it is difficult, but it was probably more than 20% of the homes now, many years later, did not get put back. Some of these people chose to move away. And in Fort McMurray, for a whole host of reasons, that will be a choice that some people will think about and decide to do, that they don't immediately want to rebuild. They'll move on with their life and they'll move elsewhere. I think the vast majority do want to move back to Fort McMurray. This is a thriving community, and it will be again. But there will be some who will choose not to go back.
A lot of people just feel helpless at a time like this, that the fire is just too much to deal with. Your business is resilience. So what do you think that people can do practically to be resilient as possible in the face of a disaster like this?
So these extreme events do have some very positive elements that have been discussed about people pulling together to help, especially during this immediate period of response, but also can have this long-term positive effect in terms of making people think in the community and in other communities about how these risks should be managed. So there is a lot of good literature that's been around and a lot of good evidence about how to live in these vulnerable areas vulnerable to wildfires, and live as safely as possible. But maybe not enough people in Fort McMurray thought about them in the past, but they will put more attention to these things in the future. One of the top programs is called Fire Smart. Fire Smart is a national program, but it's been supported and grew out of Alberta and is very actively used in Alberta and BC and Saskatchewan and elsewhere. And I think everybody in Fort McMurray should be aware of Fire Smart and what it means. It talks about how to have a defensive space around your home. It talks about the need to make sure that your home is built out of fire-resilient materials. There's a number of things that have been talked about, have been known in the past. Were they understood by everybody in Fort McMurray? I think they'll be better understood. I think they'll be part of the rebuilding and the recovery process, is to think about this knowledge that exists out there and how it applies to each family.
There have been people comparing this fire to Slave Lake. You've looked at and studied Slave Lake and other disasters. What are your observations on trying to? I mean, I know that Fort McMurray is still unfolding as we speak, but what are your observations on the comparisons?
Yeah, it's since we haven't been allowed back in and the fire's not out, we don't have enough information about Fort McMurray specifically. Since Slave Lake, we have been hoping that was a wake-up call to a lot of people living in that part of Canada, in the northern part of Canada, that once these forests burn, we have these remarkable individuals who go out and put out these fires, and 95% of the time, or whatever it is, they put out the fires very quickly before it expands and grows. But a few get away. And when they get away, they can grow very quickly, and they're incredibly unpredictable. And so for people living in these areas, they can cause great destruction quickly. So in Slave Lake, a third of the community was destroyed. In Fort McMurray, it won't be a third of the community, but it'll be a high percentage of a larger community. So there'll be larger losses in Fort McMurray than there were in Slave Lake. But there are many, many communities across the northern part of Canada, northern part of Alberta and BC and Saskatchewan, that have the similar kind of vulnerability. They're in a large forest. They're in forests that burn. They will be protected by brave souls who will go out and fight these fires. But every now and then, one will get away, and every now and then it'll get away when the weather is just doing the wrong thing. And so bad luck will come again someday.
There are lots of people who are trying to figure out the costs of this. What are your thoughts on that?
So it's too early. And to properly do the cost, you have to go in and see what's there. And the information coming out about which properties are destroyed or the state is quite mixed right now. We see some visual evidence coming out of communities that are completely devastated and destroyed, and your heart goes out to people who can see their own homes and some of the damage that they're seeing. And then other pieces of evidence showing parts of the community where they have fought it back and the fire did not get in and it did not spread and did not do the damage. So it's too early to put a number on it.
We've seen the Bank of Montreal say that it could be $9 billion.
Yeah, so that's interesting speculation, but it's not a measure of what's happening, and that'll take a little bit longer before we can actually measure what's happened. But I think with a lot of confidence, it's quite clear this is the largest disaster in Canadian history. This is bigger than Slave Lake. This will probably add up to being much more than the flood in Calgary and the ice storm in Quebec.
You mentioned the Fire Smart program. Is there any other lesson, do you think, that both provincial, federal, municipal governments should be taking away from what we're seeing unfold here?
Again, Canadians should be very proud, as I hear they are, of the terrific coordination and support that has coming from the government and from individuals and corporations. This has been a great coming together to help and do the right things. To evacuate, an evacuation of this size is unprecedented for fire, and on a scale that has almost never happened before. And so there's a lot of positives to reflect upon. At the same time, there is a broad sense that our nation has spent less focusing on preventing hazards from becoming disasters. In this case, a wildfire, but there's also other risks like flooding and earthquakes and windstorms that we could, as a country, have a better coordinated, greater investment in an overall mitigation prevention strategy. And I hope that will be one of the long-term lessons that we will take out of Fort McMurray.
Paul Kovacs, thanks so much for joining us in studio, sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you for the opportunity, Duncan.
Paul Kovacs is the founder and executive director of the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction at Western University.